This is Chapter 2, Economic Inequality, from Social Problems, Social 102. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to look at economic inequality and really look at it from the positionality of social stratification. So social stratification is a society's system of ranking categories of people within a social hierarchy. So think of it as like a ladder, right? And people that are at the top of the ladder are the ones that are considered the most socially valuable, and those at the bottom of the ladder are the ones who are considered the least socially valuable. So stratification produces social classes, which are categories of people who have similar access to resources and financial opportunities. So, of all the hierarchies and inequalities that we will discuss in this course, I have found that this one seems to be the most obvious to many people, right? Social classes, especially the idea of hierarchy, as we talk about the groups as having different statuses related to their place in the hierarchy. They're literally ranked, right? We call it upper class, middle class, lower class. So it's pretty easy to understand it as a hierarchy, but as we'll talk about in this class, there's also social hierarchies involved when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to all sorts of other social identities. Okay, so let's talk more about inequality within the US. So looking at income and wealth inequality. So any discussion of poverty must start with income and wealth. So it's important to understand the distinction between the two. Income is the salary or wages from a job plus earnings from investments and other sources that someone might make in 1 year. So income's basically like the money you get from a job, right? Wealth is different. Wealth is the value of all economic assets owned by a person or family minus any debt. So wealth is made up of more than money that's earned. It includes things like the value of a home that you might own, the value of a car, of stocks, bonds, other real estate, and businesses. So for most of us, we get our income, but we don't have that much wealth. And we'll talk about that kind of distribution of wealth in the United States. It's incredibly unequal, right, in the way it's distributed. The highest earning class in America tend to earn about, almost 50% of all the income. So that's 1/5 of all families. So, and this is more than 13 times as much as the 3.7% of income that's earned by the bottom 1/5 of families. So when it comes to, just income distribution, the wealthiest are taking in the most income. And the people that are at the top high earners of the upper middle class are taking in a lot of this income, while people at the bottom are taking in just a tiny fraction of that income. But when it comes to wealth distribution, wealth is much more unequally distributed than income is, right? Because think about it. If income is unequal and you're poor, then you probably can't save up enough money to get a house or a car or these other things that then become part of wealth, right? Versus wealthy people, they make ridiculous amounts of money, so they can take that money and turn it into, stocks and bonds and investments and other, maybe properties that they rent out. Or it's kind of like the nightmare I'm living in where I can't buy a damn house because every rich person has just bought all the decent houses and turned them into Airbnbs so that people in my generation can spend a couple grand spending the weekend at a place. They can make way more money that way than just letting stable people live within communities like myself, who would get my paycheck and put it right into my mortgage. Instead, I put my paycheck right into my landlord's pocket. So anyway, that's a little bit of my own spin coming in there. But anyway, obviously, wealth distribution is even more unequal. So income and distribution is very unequal. As you'll see in the additional materials I put in this week's module, right, you'll see the kind of wealth and income distribution in the United States. And, it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around just how vastly unequal this is. It's the worst it's ever been in American society. So when it comes to wealth distribution, again, the richest 20% of U.S. families control 90% of all privately owned wealth, right? At the same time, the poorest 20% have zero wealth at all. They're actually in debt. So they own nothing, but they owe beyond what they don't own, right? So, we'll talk about this more especially when we talk about the economy, like how did this happen and those kind of things. But we're also going to talk about some of the ideological ways in which we justify this inequality, right? We make up these myths to pretend like this is normal and that this is just an issue of individual effort or merit, when obviously that's not the case. Okay, so continuing to look at economic inequality in the United States, there's this trend towards increasing economic inequality. So the problem is getting worse, and that's why it needs such urgent attention. We see when doing research clear patterns of rising levels of economic inequality in the United States. It's harder than it's been in generations. So my generation, I'm older than you, is the first in a while that's expected to do worse than their parents or grandparents, which is a change from previous generations. There's this expectation that you would do better, you would have more opportunities. But actually, from my generation on, all the generations past that, we are more constrained than our parents and grandparents, meaning the costs of everything are much higher. The ability to make decent incomes is much lower. So, it's much more of a pinch. And they always say this like, oh, millennials are killing the housing market. Yeah, it's not a choice to not buy a house when you just don't have enough money to not buy a house, right? It's not that you're like, I just hate houses and I'm going to protest them. Like, no, it's a matter of not having 80 grand to put down on something. And then, the retail housing companies saying things like, well, just get a loan from your family. And you're like, well, that's a very social class privileged perspective. Not everyone can go, mommy, daddy, give me $100,000 because they don't have it. So we'll talk about too, especially home ownership is a big part of this, as home ownership gives the financial opportunities to help the next generation as well, right? To kind of have something that you can borrow against. So we'll talk about that later too, why that's so important and how that was, specifically denied communities of color, which leads to a lot of the inequalities we still see today. But I'm jumping ahead. Anyway, so the inequality that we have in our culture is much more obvious than it's ever been before, especially through the kind of Trump-era tax legislation that gave the biggest tax cut to billionaires, more than any previous legislation, even more than, the Reagan trickle-down economics. So it is related to the old Reagan trickle-down economics theory, which is not supported by data, right? The idea is that if you give all the rich people a ton of money, it's going to trickle down, right? They're going to give some more here and there. But in reality, if you give poor or working class or even middle class people more money, that money invigorates the economy. Because billionaires can never spend anywhere near what they earn. So the adage of job creators is another rich person myth used to justify how obviously unfair the system is. So surveys find the majority of people feel that the U.S. economy system is rigged against them in favor of the wealthy and in favor of corporate interests, and they are not incorrect about this. So a big kind of social motivation or understanding is this belief in the American dream. You work hard, you'll get ahead, just kind of put your nose to the grindstone and keep working and you're going to succeed. So that belief in the American dream has actually declined quite a bit in recent years. As George Carlin would say, I can't play you that clip in here because there's just way too many F-bombs. But, if you got the stomach for a lot of F-bombs, I encourage you to watch it. You can look it up on YouTube. George Carlin's still, impactful words on today. That's why they call it the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it. So anyway, the share of the income that goes to the 1%, there is a figure in your book that examines this from 1913 to 2015. And you see that, in 1929, the richest 1% earned about 1/4 of all income. But what happened in the late 20s, right? The stock market crash, which caused people to develop laws and other policies to try to address that inequality that, if left rampant, has large social consequences on the entire society. So as a result of those laws and policies, from 1929 to 1980, the share of income for the richest 1% actually declined. But in 1980, and due to the elephant that's often ignored in this analysis, conservatism and Ronald Reagan, this share of money going to the 1% began to increase. And so this was spurned on, administration after administration, peaking during the George W. Bush years in 2007, to be nearly at the same level it was in 1929. Right? So again, 1929 stock market crash, you've learned about that. What happened in 2007? The recession. So it's now increasing again, right? Ever since those Trump tax cuts took place, which was the largest wealth transfer from the poor to the ultra rich in American history, it's an ongoing and developing issue. It does have some clear patterns, though, that we will discuss when we talk about the economy, that sometimes, unfortunately, being the canary in this coal mine many times, I can see it coming. It seems pretty obvious when you see, the fact that the prices of cars, the prices of homes, again, this is just me personally, but I've been looking at places on Zillow like a crazy person, and you see homes that someone sold 1 year ago and they're now worth $250,000 more, which makes zero sense. They put like a coat of paint on it and then they're like, it's worth $250,000 more. But again, it's part of a larger kind of pattern of what happens as these bubbles build and then they burst, right? We'll talk about that later when we talk about the economy. So when it comes to taxation, the government collects taxes for 3 reasons. The operating of the government, which takes money to do so, to discourage, hoarding behaviors, which clearly isn't working, and as a tool to redistribute income and reduce inequality. But when you let the corporations and the rich people have million loopholes in there, then the intent of the taxation system is completely undermined. So when you look at progressive taxation, this is a model where your tax burden goes up as your income increases, or the idea that if you have more money to spare, you can help more. So those who are who have, the most money give a percentage bit more, but those who are, the worst off can face less taxation. So we have a system like this, but the problem is the wealthy have great lawyers, and they also, pay politicians to change the laws in their favor. So, their lawyers can circumvent the tax laws, and the laws become even more skewed towards the rich, like those Trump tax cuts. So I should point out, though, that we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world, with a handful of billionaires who live here who made tens of billions of dollars during the pandemic, when the rest of us were facing pay cuts, layoffs, unemployment, job insecurity, less stability. They made money, a ridiculous amount of money. These same people did not pay taxes at all for some years, like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Michael Bloomberg, George Soros. Bloomberg was the guy who bought his way into the 2020 presidential race, you might remember. And he spent $936,225,041.61, or nearly $1 billion running for president for like a month. Right? And during that time period, what killed me the most was the quote-unquote liberal media, right, the mainstream media. What they did was they tried to attack Bernie Sanders by saying, hey, what's the difference? Bernie Sanders has a couple $1 million. Michael Bloomberg is worth, tens of billions of dollars. Same deal, right? But it's an incredibly false equivalence to compare a millionaire and a billionaire. So for instance, if you made, $1 every second, you would be a millionaire in 11 days. But it would take you 31 years to be a billionaire, right? And let alone to be actually Bloomberg, how much money he had when he was running for president. It would take you nearly 2,000 years of making $1 a second versus the 11 days it takes to make someone like Bernie Sanders, who again didn't get the money from some sort of, all the corporate overlords filling his pockets. He did it by selling a book. Anyway, so the problem too moves past just individuals. Again, almost 100 companies paid 0 taxes in 2018. I believe it was 91 huge companies such as Netflix, JetBlue, Levi Strauss, Whirlpool, Goodyear Tires, Delta Airlines, Chevron, FedEx, General Motors, Halliburton, Starbucks, Amazon, Dow DuPont, Avis Budget Rentals, Alaska Airlines, Activision Blizzard, Duke Energy, MGM Resorts, and so on and so on and so on, for nearly 100 companies that could absolutely afford to pay taxes. There are probably 5 Starbucks within a mile of here, right? They are not struggling. They can pay. Or Amazon? Does Amazon not need to pay taxes? So again, we let them get away with these things, and this becomes the corporate culture, right? Okay, so moving on to the rich and the poor. So who are they? The rich are families that fall within the top 10% of the income distribution. These are the people with an annual income of $196,000 or more. But again, that's an average. Is more like $300,000 a year. Must be nice, right? And again, that's nationally, right? We live in California where some of the national figures just don't really make sense to us because things are way more expensive here, right? But anyway, so who is most likely to be wealthy? Well, it falls in line with the power dynamics of society. So older people, men, married couples, and non-Hispanic white people. The poor are, typically poor families that are struggling to get food or pay rent and just stay healthy. So the poverty line is the income level set by the government for the purpose of counting the poor. In 2016, 12.7% of the population fell below the poverty line. In your book, there's a table with figures from 2016 to show that the poverty line for an individual was considered making less than $12,228 a year, or less than $15,569 a year as a couple. The poverty line is an old invention. It doesn't account for many modern expenses, like the increased cost of college, healthcare, technology. Think about how much phones cost. We used to just not have cell phones, right? So it does not look at debt. It looks at income. And that's why the poverty line can be, kind of a problematic line, because plenty of people, maybe they make over that particular line of per individual or per couple, but they're still struggling in poverty. And that's what we call the poverty gap, right? The difference between the official poverty line and the actual income of a typical poor household. Many people live on the margins, where they might not qualify for government support, or they do, but minimal support, but they're still struggling paycheck to paycheck without any economic stability, such as any money in their savings. Nearly 6 out of 10 Americans do not have enough money in savings to deal with an unexpected expense that's $500 to $1,000. So like your car breaks down, you have to go to the doctor, anything like that. 6 out of 10 Americans do not have money to pay for that. So who are the poor? And again, just side note, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, 6 out of 10 Americans don't have to pay for that. Fun fact, as we'll talk about later when we talk about health, in other industrialized countries, people don't have to pay for healthcare. They don't have to pay for college. Those things are subsidized through the government, largely because they are not letting all those rich people not pay taxes. And so when they get those people's tax dollars, that funds free public education systems. Just like how we have K through 12 schools, you don't have to pay to go. That's how their community college and state school systems are. Same thing with healthcare, right? We're the wealthiest country in the history of the world, but we don't have these supports for the poor. We put it economically on them to figure out. And that's why a lot of people use emergency room services instead of preventative care, which, cuts their lifespan and also puts a financial burden on the entire system. So anyway, who are the poor? We'll talk about this too. There's some general patterns we can see in poverty when we look at different demographic groups. So when it comes to age, children are statistically the most likely to live in poverty. When it comes to race and ethnicity, people of color are more likely to face poverty because of institutional and personal discrimination, especially African Americans and Latinx populations, which again is the result of discrimination in housing, in employment, and other factors, like mass incarceration we'll talk about. And then when we look at gender, we see that women are more likely to live in poverty than men. And when examining family patterns, single mothers are the most likely to struggle financially. There's also regional differences, with more poverty seen in the South and in the West than in other regions of the country. Okay, so looking a little bit more in depth at some of these groups. So working families, working harder. So the book asks the question, who do families seem to be working harder, or why, not who, why do families seem to be working harder for less? It's because wages are stagnant, or the increases in wages that happen when you work overtime are smaller than it was in the past. So this leads to stalled earnings as prices go up, but wages stay at the same level or stay stagnant. More young adults are living with their parents up into their 30s or later, because it's so difficult to find affordable housing or a job that can support living independently. So it's not as if all these people are not working, many are, but it's just so hard to put down roots in the same way that people could in generations past. So, and of course, there are many economic changes that have happened in recent years that provide less opportunities. So along with stagnant wages, it's more expensive than ever to go to college, healthcare costs are out of control, the technology we rely on for modern lives, like internet access, a computer, a smartphone, these are all crazy expensive, right? And they have to be updated often. You can't just like get a smartphone 15 years ago and you're fine. It's like a brick now, right? None of the updates will work. So this means that even though people are working multiple jobs and they're working more hours than ever in American society, people are struggling to have stability, let alone to get ahead and to have money to buy like a house or cars or invest in the stock market or other things that middle class and wealthy people do to grow their wealth. When it comes to the working poor, over 10% of heads of house of the working poor work full-time, yet still remain well below the poverty line. Full-time work at the minimum wage yields income well below the poverty line for a family of four. And again, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour like it was over a decade ago. There's even, when we had that recall election in California a while back, there was a candidate that was running that wanted to repeal California's state minimum wage and replace it with the federal minimum wage, right? When California's state wage had become $15, and his name was Larry Elder, he wanted to replace it with $7.25, which would have had catastrophic waves through California economy. Think about all the people that couldn't afford the rent that are then going to become homeless or evicted. It's just the catastrophe of that. But again, why would you do that? We'll talk about that later with Marx surplus value, because you make money off of not paying people what they're worth. That's why Bezos is so rich. Okay, so the non-working poor, in 2015, 62% of heads of these kinds of households, of some poor families, were not working, though about 30% are working full or part-time, not full-time. And there's various reasons for this. Sometimes this is due to having poor health or a disability, which restricts what kind of jobs people can get. It can be a lack of education or training so that you're not able to get opportunities that actually pay well. And the larger lack of jobs that we're going to discuss later when we talk about the economy, it's harder to get a job than in previous generations because many people now feel like you have to get a bachelor's degree just to get an entry-level job, and going to college is not accessible to everyone financially. And of course, another problem, especially for parents of young children, is a lack of affordable childcare. It can cost as much as a college education per year to provide childcare. The average price for licensed childcare in California is roughly that of the tuition of the CSU each year. And then when looking at the underclass, these are poor people who live in areas with high concentrations of poverty and limited opportunities for schooling or work. Persistent poverty is what the underclass experience, not temporary poverty as some experience when they're between jobs or maybe they're in college, so they're eating ramen. But crippling poverty, from which you can never escape, is very different. That's persistent poverty. And part of what this leads to is this experience is hypersegregation. This is the concentration of poverty in inner city and rural areas. We'll discuss later the interesting parallel between the problems faced in rural areas and inner city areas, which are completely different social environments, but what they share is a lack of resources and people that are stuck in generational poverty. Okay, so looking at some problems linked to poverty, one is poor health, we'll talk about later as well, but there's a strong link between income and health. If you have to pay for medical care in this country, unlike many other countries, if you're rich, you can afford any medical bill that comes your way, or to elect to do any procedure that you might need, or take any medication that you might need. But for most of us, one medical emergency or one medical ongoing issue can bankrupt us. Later, we'll talk about healthcare as a social institution and a social problem, but for now, just know that poverty means less access to medical care and also less access or ability to afford healthy foods. Stress is another issue. Stress is disproportionately experienced by the poor, and this can lead to tobacco, alcohol, and drug use. When you're poor, you can't just go to a therapist like rich people do, or get some, masseuse in Malibu. So people self-medicate, and then we demonize them for self-medicating, as if they somehow wouldn't be in poverty if they didn't smoke cigarettes. I hear this a lot about coffee, or especially with my generation, they're like coffee or avocado toast. Like, if you want to save money, and then just make coffee at home, which is true in a small scale, right? Yeah, it's cheaper to buy a bag of coffee and pour it into a machine at home than to buy it out there, at the Starbucks all the time, right? But it's not like you're spending thousands of dollars a month, right? And that that would be the significant difference that would result in moving a poor person to the middle class. But spending, $50 at Starbucks in a week, even in a week, let alone in a month, it's still not going to make the difference. In all of a sudden now they're able to move into a whole new income bracket. But that's just another way. We like to justify inequality by blaming it on the individual, especially in our country because we believe in rugged individualism. Unless you're rich, unless you're a bank, in which case, or unless you're the auto industry, in which case we have to come and bail you out. So another health consequence of poverty is an infant mortality rate, which is twice as high for the poor than for those who are more affluent, another consequence of living in a system where you have to pay for health care. As a result of health inequities, poor people have shorter lifespans than the rich. They're more likely to die earlier from infectious diseases, from violence, and from accidents than the rich. Then there's also the issue of substandard housing. We all know it's crazy ridiculous to rent these days. There's a low availability of low rent apartments. And when people spend more money on rent, they have less money to save, invest, or use if they have emergency expenses, like their car breaks down or they need medical care. So that kind of connects to homelessness, right? This is the plight of poor people who lack shelter or live primarily on the streets. About 554,000 people are homeless on any given night, are the estimates, and about 1.6 million people are homeless at some point in the year. Though some homeless advocacy groups argue the real numbers are much higher, we just have an estimate. When it comes to an average income for homeless families, it's about a little less than $500 a month in California, but it can cost $1,000 a month to live in a rat-infested, cockroach-filled motel. So homeless families have barely enough money to eat, let alone pay rent somewhere. Another problem linked to poverty is limited schooling. 30% of poor children do not graduate from high school, and fewer poor children enter college. And that means they have less chance at getting an advanced degree, which is how you get jobs that pay you well, right? We all know that education is linked to social class. The more education you get, the more opportunity you have at higher paying jobs. And then when it comes to crime and punishment, as we talked about a little bit before, the focus on street crime we have in this culture means that poor people are more likely to face arrest, trial, conviction, and prison. Also, poor people can't afford lawyers. They have to depend on public defenders and other court-appointed attorneys. And if you take my crim class, we talk about how in some situations, you don't even get that, right? Because, like states like Wisconsin say if you make over, I can't remember, it was something so low. It was like, if you make over like $2,000 a year, then you don't get the free lawyer. And you're like, but that's making like $0 a week. So anyway, the more poor people enter the system, and if they're not having great representation, then more of them are going to get convicted. And this makes it much harder to get a job once you have a criminal record. Many people end up in the system for simple drug possession, which then leaves them vulnerable to job loss once they're released from jail, prison, or probation. Another problem linked to poverty is political alienation. 80% of people who make money, like at least six figures or over $100,000 a year, 80% of them vote. But a little less than 50% of those who make under $40,000 a year vote. So what does that suggest? It suggests that rich people have the time and energy and the kind of space to do that. But if you're broke, you're not going to have the time and energy to research, okay, what proposition is this and this and that. And also, you might just not have time off from your job to do it, even though legally they're supposed to give that to you. I've had that experience of having multiple jobs, and each job will kind of push it off on the other job. Also, it could be linked to political alienation. Just this idea that, why vote if you feel like it doesn't affect you? Right? Or it's something we call political efficacy. This idea that your vote matters or your voice matters, that can obviously be curtailed in a situation where you're facing extreme poverty because you're just trying to survive day to day. You can't really worry yourself about the larger world when you don't have the mind space and the energy to kind of deal with that, right? In the same way that rich people do. And so they're able to kind of vote for legislation that then shapes the world to be more in their interest. And again, there's way more poor people than rich people. So if poor people showed out to vote in 80% margins, we'd see a lot of shifting rules and laws. Okay, so responding to poverty, how do we deal with it? Well, social welfare programs are organized efforts by government or sometimes by private organizations or individuals, to assist the needy people that are defined as worthy of assistance. And how we define someone as worthy of assistance is controversial and tied to racism, sexism, all sorts of stuff. So these programs, though, benefit people or activities that, we think, or at least government-wise, have been deemed worthy, like, giving people mortgage rebates or deductions, student loan assistance, farm subsidies, things like that. But a lot of social welfare programs will reduce inequality, but only a little. They're kind of like a Band-Aid, which obviously do help in the immediate term, but they're not large scale enough to really address economic inequality. So when we look at a brief history of welfare, it's important to understand where this came from and why it's such a weird, under attack and not provided form of assistance today versus, like I said, in all the other industrialized countries, they have large controlled safety nets for people so they don't slip through the cracks. So when we look at our own history about this is where we get our belief system. So in the colonial era is what I meant to say. In the colonial era, charity was really limited to acts of personal kindness. There was no large organization that helped distribute aid like there is today. It wasn't until the early industrial era that we started getting these kind of welfare programs, right? Immigration affected attitudes about supporting the poor because immigrants were poor and nativists were xenophobic, meaning they didn't want to give money to support immigrants. Many still feel that way today. Different immigrants from different countries, but same stigma and fear as in previous generations. So in this time, it was also when we first started seeing large organizations to aid the poor in this country. In the 20th century, after the stock market crash and the Great Depression, we knew poverty was a widespread social problem. So Roosevelt tried to address this with the New Deal, which offered many social welfare policies and programs that we still have today, like Medicare, Social Security. It provided home loans, but this too is affected by racism. So the benefits of these programs were more beneficial to white Americans. In the 1960s, social movements looked at poverty as a social issue, something that was very important to Martin Luther King Jr., as he was promoting the Poor People's Campaign when he was murdered. This same campaign continues today, led by the Reverend William Barber, and they're still advocating for poor and low-income Americans. In 1996, when Clinton was in power, so let me back up a minute. Clinton, when he was president, he ran in 1992 on a pledge to, quote, end welfare as we know it, end quote. And he made that a reality with the 1996 Welfare Reform. And of course, the crime bill, the telecommunications bill, all sorts of terrible legislation during the 90s. Yes, we got a surplus. Yes, we got some good stuff. But there was also some mistakes made during that time period. And a big one was this welfare reform policy. So just to back up slightly, you have to understand the political context of that time period, right? So you have in the 80s and early 90s, the conservatives beating the drum on this trope of what they called the welfare queen, right? Very racialized. We'll talk about this later. We talk about race, but incredibly racialized narrative. The idea that anyone who was on welfare was just, socially loafing, kind of taking away money from hard-earning white people and giving it to people of color who were just kind of chilling and, not working hard, manipulating the system. And all of this, fun fact, was based on one particular woman. It's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, we'll talk about the history of that later on. But anyway, so you have to understand where Clinton was coming from. He's trying to win over the more moderate voters, which is never a good thing. And he basically, promoted this Welfare Reform Act, which he then has said, yeah, it was a mistake. But, hindsight's 20/20. So again, part of the context is that at the time, Democrats had lost a few high-profile elections in a row. So Democrats like Clinton decided to be purple, meaning, conservative Democrats that were there to appeal to moderate and conservative voters. So you know how we think of like red and blue for the two main parties? Purple is more what, Clinton was doing. So there was this public clamor about how unfair it is for people to, to get these resources and be able to feed their children. But fun fact, did you know that welfare was not considered controversial until after the 1960s? what happened in the 1960s that might have affected people's perceptions of welfare? The civil rights movement? This idea that if they get money, then I don't support it. This is when narratives about those who deserve it, or the idea that people are just taking handouts, or that, money should be for the good white people. It's pretty obvious in retrospect. So at the time, Clinton got a lot of political points and clout for promoting this awful reform bill that put limits on welfare. And what was replaced, welfare was replaced with TANF, right? It's called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. So it has work requirements to get aid. It puts a cap on how many years you can receive aid. So supporters would say, hey, look, less people are on welfare. That means it's working. But critics argue that, poverty hasn't actually dropped at all. Poverty's gone up. It's just the number of people that can receive aid has dropped. So it's a matter of opinion on whether or not these things are working. Okay, looking at some different theories of poverty. So structural functionalism, they're always looking at some poverty being inevitable, right? So they think it's the structure of society where some people need to be socially rewarded leads to a situation where, there's going to be some inequality. So for the first level is the kind of, when you look at this social pathology to disorganization to modern, it's like oldest theory to newest theory. So in the beginning theories of structural functionalism, you have this social pathology, the idea of personal deficiencies. So focusing on a person themselves as having a problem, which is why they're not succeeding, right? So this is kind of where we get that culture of poverty argument that argues that people just want to live in poverty, or that they just learn poverty and therefore are poor. Of course, we have a more modern spin on culture of poverty at this point to say that there's different habits and attitudes you may learn while living in different social classes. So that's, a different, more modern spin on it that doesn't really take that same kind of blaming approach to say, like, oh, you're just a piece of crap and that's why you're poor. Just don't be so terrible and then you won't be poor. Or don't be a social minority and then you won't be poor, which is obviously not something people can control. So when you look at this idea that forms the basis of pathology theories is meritocracy, the idea that it's a level playing field. If we just work hard, we can achieve success. And this is where we get a lot of those American dream mythology stuff from, right? Meritocracy, you know what? I wish it was. I really wish it was. I wish that we lived in a situation where your social standing was a correspondence to how much work and effort you put in. And you do see these exceptional cases of people that make it through that we point to as like tokens to say, well, look, they made it, they did it against the odds, so anyone can do it. And that's just not the case. Not anyone can do it. Yes, sometimes people do, persist and actually break through the odds against them, but that doesn't deny the real struggles that they face and the barriers that still remain in place for everyone behind them. It's not like when we break barriers and we open doors so that the next generation doesn't have to deal with the same problems. And this false meritocracy system, we just say, well, you didn't succeed because you didn't try hard enough. And then as if the rich kid whose dad owns a Fortune 500 company, as if that kid worked so much harder than you and that's why he's rich. And not because his dad gave him a company. All right, so looking at their theory of social disorganization theory, this is that, if there's too much change going on, that can cause disruptions or dysfunctions, right? So they say there's a breakdown in social order that happens when there's rapid social change. And specifically to do this was like the proximal zones and all this kind of stuff they did. Again, take my crim class and we'll talk about it more in depth. But they're looking at the organization of cities into zones and saying that each zone is kind of pressing upon the next, almost in a kind of invasive species kind of way, in the way that we look at the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom in that way of one species takes over another's area. That's kind of the way they were looking at people in the kind of social environment of cities. And then more modern functional theory really looks at how the inequality of rewards actually, does, at least in their view, help society function efficiently. So for example, they would say that you have to pay a doctor a lot more money than the janitor, right? Because the doctor has to go through a lot of years of training and has to be very skilled. And the idea is that if you set more money for a job, then you get the best person for the job, right? And there's some great, points to that, but that ignores nepotism. That ignores the fact that, like, the golf buddy of the guy who owns the hospital is more likely to accept the dude into his residency that's his friend's son, or to cut corners with some of these things, or be able to, recommend people that aren't necessarily the most qualified because of the social circles in which they travel. So I wish it was the case. I wish there wasn't nepotism. I wish people didn't put the thumb on the scale and that the people that were the best just rose to the top, because there are situations where that happens. But basically that, Herbert Gans, he's also another modern functionalist that talks about how inequality is really, useful only to rich people. The inequality works for them. They want the system to be unequal because they can manipulate that system. Think about it, like if you're Jeff Bezos, you can keep wages fairly low and make billions of dollars off the backs of your employees because they don't really have that many other options of what to do. Plus, he's been pretty successful at stopping them from forming unions. So, that inequality makes him richer, right? In the same way that if you have to pay your employees more money, if you have to give them healthcare benefits and retirements and workplace safety conditions and make sure they can take breaks where they don't have to pee in a bottle or something like that, then that's going to cut into his almost trillions, soon to be trillions of dollars of money. And so that becomes, well, let's not do that. It's useful to have that inequality because what can they do? If workers protest or strike, they can just replace them with new workers that also are desperate for a job, that also need that money. And so people being stuck in desperate situations is very advantageous for capitalists. Okay, looking at theories of poverty from symbolic interactionist perspective. So they look at how do we define the problem of poverty? What is it that we see as a social problem? So they look at how we socially construct social problems and highlight the social construction of how do we conceptualize a problem, but then how do we define a solution? So they explore the meanings that rich people attach to those who are poor, and how the meanings of being poor and the way that rich people get to define that, how this leads to a particular understanding of who or what is responsible for poverty. Or, what William Ryan calls blaming the victim. So William Ryan argues that you just pick a social problem, right, so poverty in this case, and then you decide how people who suffer from the problem are different from other people. So let's say, one of the things people love to say is the organization of the family itself, right? Oh, there's just not enough fathers present, right? Oh, this is a great one when it comes to, poor communities of color that are affected by mass incarceration. They'll be like, where are the fathers? And you're like, in prison, because they're being swept up in this system. So anyway, they'll say, oh, well, that's the reason that people are experiencing poverty, because it's the absence of fathers in the household. Right? Or they'll find some other thing that differs, like, oh, okay, these are the particular kinds of jobs people are doing, or, this is the kind of living situation they're living in, or whatever it is, and blame that as the problem without actually looking at what is actually causing poverty to be the issue. It's not poor people, right? It's rich people, and it's the systems and institutions that financially benefit those wealthy people and wealthy corporations. So the thing is, when we blame the victim, we respond to the problem by trying to change the victim, not the larger society. And this is why it's such a powerful metaphor for what's going on in our culture. Because if you just say, like, hey, work harder, and point at a person and say, hey, the problem is they drink. The problem is they get Starbucks and avocado toast and don't save their money, or whatever it is you blame them for. Instead of saying, well, isn't the problem that we live in the wealthiest country in the history of the entire world, and yet a handful of people, less than 20 people, own the majority of all of that money? And, like, isn't that the problem? Isn't the problem that we don't tax those people? That those people can act like they're gods and try and travel into space, and we do nothing? We just stand idly by when they get to make, new tax laws and things in their benefit? So anyway, maybe that's the problem, and not poor people being born into a situation they can't control, right? Anyway, that's a great transition into Social conflict analysis, right? That poverty can be eliminated. They argue that, it's a choice. It's a social choice that we're making because rich people make a ton of money off of the current organization of society. Why would they want to change that? Like, why would you change something that affects your bottom dollar? It's why those same climate, like the oil industry and coal industry people pretend like they don't understand climate change. Because yeah, if something goes against your direct paycheck, you might pretend like you don't understand it exists too. So social conflict analysis says we can eliminate poverty, we just have to actually work to structure a more equitable system in order to do that, and part of that involves like actual progressive taxation and stuff like that. So some of this rests on or comes from the development of Marxist theory, which looks at poverty and capitalism, and basically says that, poverty is more than just, not having money. It's also not having cultural capital, right? So cultural capital is this interesting idea. It's the way that you navigate the world. It's knowing the rules, knowing the right behaviors, the right social circles, and, it really helps you navigate. So for example, let's say if you entered college and your older siblings went to college and your parents went to college, then you have cultural capital on how to go to college, right? Because someone else has already done it. So they can give you an idea of what you're supposed to do, like how do you sign up? Where do you go? How do you register? Things like that. What if you're a first generation college student and your parents did not go to college? Then you don't have cultural capital. You don't know where do you go to sign up. You don't have someone in your corner telling you how to navigate the system so that you benefit best. And we know that students that enter with cultural capital do better typically in college because they just know how to navigate the system better, right? They know how to drop a class. They know how to, petition a course or things like that can get you through faster or can remedy issues with your GPA when you're retaking classes, whatever it might be. So sometimes it's more than just the money that you have, it's how do you know how to navigate the system. My example I love to give is if you've ever been to like a rich people dinner or, restaurant or one of those things, and you sit down and there's like 1,000 forks, like 1,000 of them, and you're like, what the hell are those for? Then you don't have cultural capital, meaning, when they bring around a certain appetizer, you don't know which one's my shrimp fork, right? Because it's kind of like a test, those forks. It's kind of really like a test, like, do you know the appropriate way to navigate within this social space? And it's a way that we keep people excluded from certain spaces is by limiting the knowledge that, especially in this case, that poor people would know of like wealthy culture or, something like academia, higher education that's actually going to help you get more money, right? And maybe move into the middle class. Also, there is multicultural theory that looks at poverty as it's connected to race and ethnicity and connected to the social inequities of the past. The fact that we've structured, the opportunity structures have been so racist, meaning, we'll talk about this later, but issues like redlining, where neighborhoods were basically blocked from being able to get FHA-backed loans, which would help people, get that economic stability of home ownership and move into the middle class. We have basically our racist history of labor is directly connected to our racist history of poverty. So if you deny people equality, if you deny them educational opportunities, you deny them work opportunities, and just social respect, then you end up in a situation where people who are, let's say, different communities of color, like African Americans or Latinx, get paid less for the same work. You have situations where immigrant populations, especially immigrants from certain areas like maybe Southeast Asia, face different challenges than those who have come from kind of white European countries. So, the value systems in the culture that say that certain people are better than or more valuable or, have more social value, that relates to then how much we need to pay somebody, right? So the more that we have these racist undertones in our ideas of who deserves what job or who has worth, that results in economic inequality along those racial and ethnic lines. Okay, so looking at theories of poverty with a feminist analysis, so they're going to look at poverty in relation to patriarchy, right? Patriarchy is just a social pattern in which men dominate women. So if men are considered more valuable as workers, then they get paid more. And this is an issue where, we'll talk about this later as well when we talk about gender a bit more. But, in basic ideas that, since we've had industrialized labor, there's always been a higher wage given to men than women. And this is something that persists into the modern day, right? We talk about this often, how women tend to make 75 to 78 cents or 79 cents, depending on your calculation, to a white male dollar. But we have to take an intersectional lens to that, right? Knowing that if you look at it more intersectionally, you see that it's not just an issue of women and men, it's an issue of different categories of women and men, right? So for instance, white women, I think they make about 77 cents to a white male dollar, while Asian women make about 78 cents to a white male dollar, and African American women make about 64 cents to that white male dollar, with Latinas making about 55 cents to the white male dollar. So it's not about just saying men make more money than women. We have to talk about, which men, which women, right? As white women and Asian women tend to make more money than Latinx men or African American men, only slightly, and depending on the industries they're in. But you see that this whole thing is stratified. It's more complicated than just saying, men make more money than women. What it's really saying is that overall the pattern is very strong that men do make more money, but it's really just that the society sees them as having more value, as being better suited for many job positions, and especially the job positions where there's like a lot of money, right? Like CEOs, or the ones where like you make all the decisions, right? Like president. Things like that are pretty much relegated to masculinity as being correct, right? Another impact of this that they look at is the feminization of poverty, where, women tend to be the ones that are the single parents when there's a single parent household, right? Like I think it's almost, a little over 8 out of 10 percentage-wise of every single parent headed family is headed by women. And we know that just being a parent and, is very expensive in our culture. And, trying to do anything on a single income is very difficult. So putting women in these situations where they're already making less money than a man would in that situation, and then having to, take care of a family by themselves financially, it just means that they're much more likely to end up in poverty or even homeless. So, we are all of our multiple intersecting identities at once, and that's what's so important to focus on this intersectional theory aspect. Like I said before, of, different categories of folks, we talk often about them as single slices, like your gender, your race, your disability, your sexuality, or any of these kind of different slices. But we're all of those things at the same time. It's not like I'm like, oh, I'm my social class today, and I'm my race tomorrow, and then the next day I'm my gender. Like, we're all of them at the same time, and the way people interpret us or understand our worth is related to the multiple intersections. Okay, so looking at constructing problems and defining solutions, very different viewpoints from different political lenses. So conservatives say it's about personal responsibility, right? They focus on personal responsibility, stressing the importance of self-reliance, right? And say, hey, if you're poor, get another job. If you're really struggling with financial insecurity, then work harder. Save your money. Don't be frivolous, things like that. Also, they often hammer this drum about relative versus absolute poverty. Oof, this one triggers me a little bit. So, absolute poverty is like, you have nothing. You have no water, you have no shelter, you have no clothes, right? Like absolute poverty is nothing. Relative poverty is being poor compared to other people in your same society. So that could be like, not having a nice place to live, not having a decent working car or a car at all, not having, a cell phone, or at least kind of like basic things that we need in our everyday lives often, or, having things that are just much worse as a result of that. So you might have, like when I grew up, we had the swamp cooler in our house, which we all kind of sat around when it got really hot, because we didn't have air conditioning, like central air conditioning. So that could be an example, like having, a tiny little box fan in your window versus having like an air conditioning system in your house, which matters in Southern California, right? That would be relative poverty. But the way conservatives argue it, they say, well, if you're not in absolute poverty, then you're not in poverty. Or they'll often say, well, look at people in developed countries or developing countries, like look at people in, India. Then look at the social conditions that some of them are living in. And you're like, yeah, but that's comparing apples to oranges. Again, we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world. So why would anyone here be living in horrible endemic poverty? Right? Why are we not offering people opportunities and ways to because often it becomes personal responsibility. Well, that person's a drug addict. And you're like, okay, well then why don't we offer them treatment programs and a way to get their life back? Right? Or, oh, that person is a felon. Okay, well why don't we offer them job training programs and a way to make their way back into society, right? Because that would cost money. And we don't want to do that. We just say, well, it's their fault. They figured it out. It's their problem, not my problem. But when we're in one society together, it is our problem, right? Because we're all in the same boat. And if that boat just keeps sinking, we all sink, right? Liberals argue about societal responsibility. They say that poverty is more structural than individual, that it has much more to do with, history, with culture, with the values, the social values we put on people. So they say the way to fix poverty is to fix those structures, put some in some societal solutions that can help alleviate the harm, right? Like during the pandemic, that child tax care credit where everyone got a couple $100 for their kids. It immediately eliminated a significant portion of child poverty. So a lot of people said, well, why can't we keep that after, right? And especially, Build Back Better and all that drama. Trying to add that to the bill to say, an expanded child tax care credit. But then, of course, Joe Manchin was like, no, if people make over, what was it, 50 or 70, something like that, grand a year as a couple, they shouldn't be able to get those benefits because, they're too rich to need them. Which is a guy who makes millions of dollars off the coal industry being like, a person who makes $40,000, they're too rich. Anyway, so, a lot of liberals will say, and again, what does liberal mean? It means changing the system from within the system, right? That's kind of like, how do you make things better? You change the systems themselves. Versus the radical left says, the system itself, it can't just be band-aid solutions here or there or one program or this, that poverty is inherent in capitalist society. So they say that despite, welfare programs or any of those kind of band-aids that might help, like, food aid, cash aid, economic inequality is increasing dramatically. So they argue, the radical left argues, that we should replace capitalism with a more humane economic system. Like sometimes this is something you hear from like Bernie Sanders, where you talk about, kind of democratic socialism, a situation where, you're still connecting it to kind of like the social value of our culture, but offering people more opportunities for things that are subsidized. So again, we already have some of these systems, like for instance, when your house lights on fire, you don't have to like pay a company to come put out the fire, right? We have this thing called, firefighters, and they show up. And that is a publicly subsidized, socialist system, right? As are the police, as are libraries and parks and things of this nature that offer certain resources to people, right? So radical left says, unless we completely replace capitalism with something more humane, nothing else is going to really change the economy and solve poverty. So going on from here, we're going to discuss income inequality, especially when it connects to issues in education. We're going to talk about the economy itself, and that has a lot of connections to this. And of course, healthcare as well, and many other social institutions that we'll come to examine later on in this class.